listening to the Devoted Dreamers podcast, and I'm your host, Merritt Onsa. I believe God has an unfolding plan for your life, a God-shaped dream just for you. But so much gets in the way, right? Fear, comparison, imposter syndrome. What if I mess this up? You are not alone in those feelings, and I'm so glad you're here for Season 8. Keep listening to gain some transformational tools that will help you release the lies so that you can freely show up in the world, offering your gifts, leaning on God in your weaknesses, and serving His kingdom with the dream He's given you. Hey Dreamer, you're listening to episode 186. I've got a solo episode for you today, and I'm doing these once a month now. So in case you're new around here, other weeks of the month we'll have interviews with dreamers, but for solos like this one, I really want to dig into topics that you desire to hear about from the perspective of pursuing your own God-shaped dream and with stories from my pursuit of my God-shaped dream. And this one has been a hot topic on a lot of people's minds, it seems. It's come up twice in 2 different Facebook polls as one of the top issues that people want to talk about. So I realize there's a risk of hearing too much about the pandemic and what we've learned from the pandemic and what we can do differently as a result of takeaways from the pandemic. But we are going to dig in today to some lessons that we can use for our future, because there is a benefit of going through a difficult time and walking away changed so that we don't keep rehashing, having to relearn the same things every time, right? So I don't know about you, but I'm curious. Did the year 2020 reveal some really hard truths about your life, like it did for me? Did slowing down because you had to reveal to you the real cost of busyness in your life? And what did you gain because of the pandemic and living in lockdown? I don't know if you're connected to John Krasinski. What's his name from The Office? Why am I not coming up with his name right now? Anyway, John Krasinski started doing these YouTube videos back in March of 2020 called Some Good News. And it was like 2 weeks into lockdown, I think, the first time I saw one of these. Gosh, it was so much what my heart needed, even after just those first 2 weeks. I remember lying in bed at night, watching those videos every time there was a new one. Like I would keep checking, is there a new one? Is there a new one? But I would lie in bed at night, just like weeping and laughing while simultaneously kind of pinching myself because it felt like we were living through this strange, bizarre dream. Clearly not the good kind of dream. But God was gracious. He's always full of grace. At the time, I had just started seeing a counselor, and I remember just some big burning questions that I was processing through at this time. You know, now that everything had shut down and I was stuck at home, I got this glimpse of what my life had become, which was busy, frenzied, rushing my kids here and there, often yelling because we were running late all the time, and I tend to be kind of a blamer. Like it was all their fault, which of course, you know, sure, they played a part, but it was not all their fault. But I had stopped seeing my children, my husband, for who they were. I had no idea this reality of what my life had become, just so busy and frazzled. And there was no end in sight to the frenzy. No end, that is, until the coronavirus. And now looking back, I couldn't even really tell you what exactly I was doing that made my life so insane, other than the fact that our calendar was always full. And this wasn't a new thing for me. I had done this for years. I was single really late into my 30s and, you know, learned to kind of cram things into my calendar so I didn't have to be alone all the time. But so this was still happening. A decade more later, I'm constantly cramming things into each little nook and cranny in the calendar, never really able to focus or concentrate on one thing or one person or one project. I mean, maybe for a few minutes at a time, but there was always so much going on in my mind. I struggled with insomnia. I would lay in bed at night. Some of this good, some of this like God showing me things that I was curious and excited about. But, when you can't sleep, something's happening, right? And so this past year, now that it's 2021 and we've lived through 2020, this past year has been profoundly different from any we've lived through, no matter where you live in the world, right? And I have often thought to myself since that all began that the metaphor of a roller coaster or a speeding train was probably a good metaphor for what I was experiencing. Like whichever it was, that vehicle was moving so quickly, there was no stopping it. I'm not sure what else could have shifted my focus like the pandemic did. And in that, I guess I can say the pandemic has been a gift. And now I know this isn't the case for everyone. I've certainly had friends who've lost loved ones, who've grieved deeply, who haven't been able to even go to funerals of loved ones because of the virus. I have friends with long haulers COVID who might suffer indefinitely from this. So please don't hear me say the pandemic is good. It's not good. And side note, because it's not good, in case you were wondering, it is also not from God. Psalm 92:15 says, "The Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him." And James 1:17, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." There is only good in God. And so the pandemic is not good. It's not from God. But this pandemic has caused me, and I would venture to say probably you, to reconsider life the way it was and to consider new avenues for my dream that I wasn't willing to or didn't have time to consider before. It has shaped my life, and I'm guessing it has shaped yours in a unique way. I remember saying to my counselor back in April, that my greatest fear for the pandemic ending, which at that point, we thought might be summer, but no one knew then. I really feared going back to who I was before, because getting this little respite, this little break, made it very clear that the life that I was living was not sustainable. And all of that is what has motivated this topic today. That and the most votes in this recent survey that I posted in my Devoted Dreamers Facebook group. And so here's what I want you to take away from this episode. These are the 3 bullet points, and I will revisit them at the end as well. But how we shift from busy to purposeful based on what we've learned from the pandemic. Here are my 3 suggestions. Number 1, get focused. Number 2, get curious. And number 3, engage with purpose and intentionality. Okay, let's talk about each of these one at a time. Number 1, get focused. One thing I think that anyone who has school-age children could say after going through this past year that we've been through is this: I had no idea what being crunched for time was before now. You're figuring out virtual learning or homeschooling or life without childcare ever. You maybe can't remember the last time you had a date with your spouse, and you've long lost your favorite babysitter's phone number, right? I mean, sure, it's in your phone, but you haven't called her in the longest time because you couldn't. And so I know, depending on where you live in the country or the world, maybe you are past some of this part of the pandemic, but these things are all still true for our family. And I know it's at least familiar to most of you. So with a lot less, quote unquote, extra time on our hands, focus is the theme that's come to the forefront. But how do we do that? And what does that even look like? And I think it's the same whether you know what your dream is or not. Like this shift in how we've had to function in our lives has really caused us to, just get rid of the fluff. Like there's a lot of things that we just haven't been able to do, which is, for now, probably like a really good thing. But as it relates to your dream, the getting focused, this is an opportunity to figure out what you're good at and what you love to do and to stay in that lane. And those 2 things I think really go hand in hand. What are you good at? And what do you also love to do? And if you've listened to anybody who's talked about like online marketing or branding, whatever, there's a lot of conversation out there about focusing on the one thing for the one person. Don't try to meet everybody's needs. Don't, try to offer 16,000 things related to how you pursue your dream. No, get clear on the one person your dream serves. Who is she or he? And what is the best use of your time in how you serve those people? What is the one thing that you're good at, that you love to do, that meets a burning need for the people that your dream serves? There will always be more to do. There's like unlimited need, right? But guess what? You get to let someone else fill in those holes. You cannot be all things to all people. And if you try, you and possibly even your dream will collapse under the weight of attempting to do that. And sometimes I like to think about this as if I were to say yes to something that really wasn't mine to say yes to, I'm actually saying no for somebody else. So if some opportunity came to me that just really wasn't in my lane and I said yes to it, I would be preventing someone else from getting the opportunity to do that. Somebody who probably needed it far more than I did. So this also is really, really hard because a lot of us grew up with this well-intentioned perspective of you can do anything you want. Whether it was parents, teachers, mentors, adults in our lives told us this as children because they didn't want to limit us. They wanted us to have options. Probably, they saw that we had far more options than they had growing up, and they wanted us to be able to feel free to take advantage of those. And they wanted us to know that we could dream big, which no fault in that, right? This is the Devoted Dreamers podcast. But I have found at some point, if you cannot get specific and focused, it becomes very, very difficult to make any forward movement because there are just too many options. Confusion is actually unkind, right? Having 25 good options is not better than having 2. I mean, that is if you actually want to have to make a decision. Like 2 options, this or that, is far better than 25 or even 10 options. And through a lot of my adult life and the struggles I've had in figuring out my career and my passions and my dream, I have looked back and I kind of wished someone somewhere along the line had said, hey, I see that you're really good at blank. What about thinking about doing this with your life? Whatever that other fill in the blank is. And instead, what I experienced, for example, in high school, was all these opportunities to be divided in my interests of music theater, cross-country running, playing flute in the band, leadership and service organizations, somewhere in there fit academics. Whatever came along that interested me, I tried it. And I was allowed to try it. And none of it helped me figure out what to focus on because I was so divided in what I was doing. And I realized that this story, the way that my story played out doesn't apply to everyone. Some of you had parents who wanted you to go into medicine or the law or whatever it was for them or for your family. But even those options, think about it. Even if you knew like, okay, I think I want to be a doctor. There are so many specializations that you can choose from that it's kind of mind numbing, right? And so even there, like you can't really, I guess you could like just be a general practitioner, right? But those who figure out and get really good at one thing, there's just so much clarity there. And freedom, right? Because you know specifically then what you're going to be doing with your days. And I bet if you just pause to think about it for a minute, I bet you know someone who is really, really good at what he or she does. They've become known for it. People think of them when they think of that particular thing. And right now, I'm thinking of a woman that I've recently come across on Instagram. Her handle is Sharon Says So. Her name is Sharon McMahon, and she calls herself America's Government Teacher. And she's curating conversations and fact sharing in this tumultuous time in the U.S. political scene. And if you have not heard of her, I really urge you to follow her. She's doing an excellent job of sharing nonpartisan facts and information related to the current events in the U.S. government, the U.S. Constitution, Congress, etc. Because really, who remembers all of those details from high school? And who can even keep up right now with the shifting of the tides, the various perspectives, and certainly the myths, misunderstandings, misapplications, and controversies and conspiracy theories? I mean, are we not getting lost in all of that? Like, where is the actual truth? And so Sharon says so. She's a teacher at heart. She's an entrepreneur, and she's a great example of stepping up with a very clear focus to fill a very clear need at just the right time. And she's doing it with a ton of integrity and a fun and winsome spirit, which sure is a shift from what politics and government has looked like recently. And guess what? People are going crazy over her. Her Instagram account has grown from 14,000 followers back in October to, I'm sure by the time this episode publishes, she'll be close to or surpassing 400,000 followers. And I heard her on a podcast just the other day say that basically on a daily basis, she gets about 1,000 questions in her question box every day. She's doing this with excellence. And if you want an example of somebody who has really narrowed down the lane that she's driving in, Sharon McMahon is a great example. So the takeaway, get focused. Who do you serve? What exactly do they need? What specifically can you do in your wheelhouse to meet that need? And another focus tip, which Sharon is also a great example of, is that if your dream involves social media engagement, find one place to focus. You cannot be in all the places and be fully present. I mean, unless you have nothing else in your life, but it's just not possible. And I want to thank Natalie Arndt, one of my friends and guests on this podcast, for this suggestion. She really encouraged me to begin to focus in one place on social media. And so I've started to do that in my Facebook group. Maybe you've noticed if you're in there, but it has made all the difference in the engagement there and how I feel about engagement in the group. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But I feel less of that pull to be in all the places once I kind of made this decision, like I'm going to double down and really put my energy into Facebook. And that has helped so much in a time like this. So it's okay to like define some boundaries for your online engagement or around what you are actually doing with your dream. And in fact, I think that focus is really going to help you feel more productive and more intentional in your God-shaped dream. Okay, number 2, get curious. And this really started in my relationship with my kids. And I'm so thankful to my counselor for this realization. So we were not very many weeks into the pandemic when I realized that prior to March of 2020, I wasn't really seeing my children. They were accompanying me places, but I wasn't really seeing them or their needs, their emotional needs, their developmental needs. I mean, sure, I knew when they were hungry or tired, but I wasn't hearing them. And they didn't really know how to express what they needed because they're still pretty little. But I have to confess, like I was just missing it with them. And I share this here because I feel like it relates to our dreaming as well. So with this pause of regular life that the pandemic has allowed, here's what I'm taking away about how we can get curious. And my counselor just used this term with me. I wrote it on a sticky note and it's just been like hitting me in the face every time I look at that. But get curious. Observe what is going on rather than always reacting. So maybe that's observe what's going on in you, what's going on in the people around you, what's going on in your dream or in your idea of your dream. What is happening? Rather than like always jumping to a reaction that like, oh, I have to do something about that right now. Just see it, acknowledge it, write it down if that's helpful to you. But most importantly, in order to do this, you have to pause. You have to stop and take a deep breath. I think I'm going to do that right now. You can do it too. Join me. Getting curious in my dream, it meant, for example, looking at my quiet little Facebook group back in August and asking, what is going wrong? What am I doing wrong? Or what am I not doing? Why aren't people engaging in here? Should I just close the group? Am I just not good at hosting a Facebook group? Do I need to take a class on how to be a good Facebook group host? No, I don't need to do that. Anyway, instead of judging or trying not to judge, I paused to get curious. And honestly, kind of by accident, I realized something. The people in the group don't really know each other. They don't have an incentive to engage. They show up there. They're probably new to the podcast. I mean, if you're in there, maybe you've had this experience. You go into the group, you don't really know what's happening in the group because you haven't been there yet, and you don't know what you want from it, but you were invited to join and you said yes. And so I decided, let's get curious and try a few new things. And so, also modeled by my friend Natalie Arndt, I started this friendly monthly competition in the group, encouraging engagement and giving a reward that I thought might be something people would want. And that was to get on a Zoom call with me and the top 3 women in the group who'd been most active in the last month. And I thought, hey, what do I have to lose? Let's just try it. And what ended up happening was it encouraged people to post, like to post their own independent posts, but to also comment and to like things that other people were posting. And then it spurred me on because I actually had this opportunity to talk face to face with some of you, which I said I wanted, but I hadn't figured out like how to make that work. And I always was just kind of blaming the medium of podcasting, like, well, it's just not possible. So it just can't happen. But when I got a chance to talk face to face with some of you, I learned things about you and your dreams that I would not have known otherwise. And doing this, like hosting this on a monthly basis and really taking the opportunity to invest in this, yes, it was going to cost me some time, but it meant and it provided the benefit of the community beginning to engage with one another. And that was gold. When your Facebook community starts to engage, Facebook says, oh, this is a popular place to be. Let's recommend it. And so for the first time ever, people were joining the group saying, Facebook recommended this group to me. And it was like, oh, how did that happen? And so as much as it has built community with you, the podcast audience, the greater takeaway for me is what pausing and building awareness and curiosity has done for me personally. So this was a practice that I started with my family and then kind of flowed over into my dream. So let me share a little bit about what that looked like as a mom and a wife. So I began to pause and look my kids in the eyes. I began to ask them follow-up questions based on something they were doing or playing with or saying or thinking about that they happened to just speak out loud. I started to get curious about those thoughts, to ask them about their wants and desires, to sit down on the floor and play with them. I mean, maybe some of you mamas out there already were doing that, but that was kind of a new thing for me. I became a mom in my early 40s, like sitting down on the floor and playing with toys was not something I felt very practiced at. And so I took time to try things with them that I hadn't done for decades. Painting, drawing, playing with Play-Doh, kinetic sand, or a slinky. And doing that, it was another opportunity to slow down. And I started to see and appreciate things about them. And also this with my husband as well. I started to see and appreciate things about him that I'd taken for granted before. And I started to see more of his heart. And I started to see my kids differently. One day I saw a look on the face of my 2-year-old. They're kind of in that stage of like, not quite baby, definitely toddler, but not little kid yet. And I saw this look on her face that I had never witnessed before. I started to see parts of their personalities that I wasn't acquainted with. And in all of this, I began to see myself more as a mom rather than just a parent or a disciplinarian or an entertainer or, a driver of taking us somewhere. And it was so interesting how beginning to do this with my kids kind of supported doing this, kind of deeper engagement and getting curious with you all as listeners. And so that's item number 2, takeaway number 2 from the pandemic is get curious. What can you see or notice about your dream, about yourself? Take this personally as well, like about the people that you engage with most regularly, whether you're married or not, or have kids or not, like get curious about what's going on. And as you allow yourself to be more present with the people that you get to engage with, I bet you're going to see some new things that curiosity prompts. This is all a great lead in to item number 3, to engage purposefully and intentionally. And this for sure has a personal component as well, as I've just discussed, relating to my kids and my spouse. But I really want to speak to this one from the perspective of my God-shaped dream. So as I'd really started to see some growth and progress and even greater confidence in how I pursue my dream, as I began to engage more deeply with listeners, as I mentioned, this happened in part by hosting those monthly conversations with the women in my Facebook group. But it kind of prompted me opening myself up to other more personal engagement with listeners in other ways. So coffee chats, I had these quarterly calls with patrons who were giving at a certain level to support the podcast. I'd had that on my calendar, but wasn't really doing it. And so I actually committed to doing that. And then over the summer, I launched a mastermind group, which gave me the opportunity to pursue this imposter syndrome beta test that I had been working on for over a year, and then the first alpha cohort of that course. And the number of you in the midst of all of that, the number of you that I have personally spoken with on a Zoom call in the last year has gone from probably what was 0 in 2019 to at least double digits in 2020. I was trying to do the math, and it maybe is somewhere between 12 and 20 of you that I've been able to engage with since the pandemic began. And it's funny, I don't know what it was before that kept me from doing that. Maybe I was just scared, or maybe I thought I didn't have time to do that. Clearly, I didn't have time to do that. You heard me say how frenzied I was. I just didn't know what it would look like because I hadn't tried it yet. But there's a pretty good chance, as I look at it now, that I was acting out of fear, wondering, if I had this idea, if I put something out there and invited people, would they actually say yes? Would anybody show up on a call with me? Or if they did show up on a call and then I was hosting it, what would we even talk about? Oh my gosh, what would I even say? Would they just sit there and stare at me with these blank faces? Why did you even invite us here? Talk about imposter syndrome, right? But this has been such a huge takeaway from the pandemic for me. And it's not rocket science, but it's how much we need one another. And the pandemic has really brought that home for me in a new way. And what's amazing is, and I'm thankful for, is that the technology required to have conversations with someone across the country or across an ocean no longer fears so much of the barrier that it once was. We've all done that, right? But we weren't doing daily video calls with people. I think earlier this week, I had 4 video calls in one day. I think that's my record so far. Today, we're all pretty Zoom savvy, right? And somehow that has removed a barrier for me of being intentional and engaging more personally with people. And so making these choices to have these purposeful, intentional conversations with some of you, it's not only opened my eyes for new ideas for this ministry, but has grown that know, like, and trust feeling between me and you with other listeners and amongst the people that gather in my Facebook group. And so that's been a really sweet outcome, is that some of you have told me, I feel like I have friends now that are connected to me on this topic of God-shaped dreams. So it's enhanced the conversations happening in the group. People have made like conscious, intentional decisions themselves to engage in the group. And so they've told me they're getting more out of it, which encourages them to do that all the more, which has a snowball effect for other people in the group because they see like, oh, this is an engaged group and these people are supportive and nobody's judging me. And I feel like maybe I could share something that's a little bit harder about my experience in pursuing my God-shaped dream. So you've started to feel more connected to each other, which is awesome because that is filling a need for you that I was never intended to fill. And I certainly don't have the capacity to fill. And so the simple decision of like, hey, maybe it would be fun to engage face-to-face with some of my podcast listeners and let them engage with each other. It has become this beautiful gift to those of you in the group who are a part of that. And so now that I know you a little bit better, taking a risk to engage in those conversations, I actually know a little bit more about what you need from me, from the podcast, from this ministry. And I'm personally gaining courage to find that one thing that I talked about earlier in the focus topic. I've been encouraged to find that one thing that I can focus on. So how do we move from busy to purposeful? None of this was rocket science. You've probably been mulling these things over in your mind as well. I'm sure if your life looked anything like mine prior to the pandemic, and if you've noticed that slowdown and kind of really treasured this opportunity to take a breath, even if you have kids doing virtual school or homeschool or whatever it is, like there's a different sense of time. There are fewer things pulling at our time. We just kind of have these big categories that do have great need. And so if we're going to move away from that like busy frenziedness to purposeful, I will say like most importantly, a change is necessary. We cannot survive, much less thrive at the pace we were living at prior to the pandemic. And so if your life looked like mine, in order to shift, these are the three things that I've found that you can do to make the most of this unique season of life. To recap, get focused, find your one thing, get curious, begin to really see the people that are connected in your life, your work, your dream. And number 3, engage with purpose and intentionality. Invest where it matters and let go of the rest. You do not have to do it all. And I would so love to engage with you on this topic. Like these are some really important things that maybe we can find some like feasible answers to what your life looks like, where you can find ways to get focused, get curious, and engage purposefully. So if you have a desire to talk about that, or you have another burning idea of a topic you would like me to cover on a future solo episode, I would so love to hear from you. Connect with me over on Facebook, Instagram, or through my website, and let's talk about pursuing our God-shaped dreams together and how we can support one another in that journey. Thanks so much for being here today. Thanks for listening today. Don't let the conversation end here. Let's connect over in the Devoted Dreamers Insiders group on Facebook. We're building a sweet community of dreamers, so no one has to walk this road alone. You can find the group at bit.ly/dreamergroup. I'll see you in there.